Professor Erin Smith is the newly appointed CEO of the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma Centre, and her new role looks at assisting journalists who are emotionally and psychologically impacted by the horrors of what they see and report. A former professor of disaster and emergency response in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at Edith Cowan University, Erin is renowned for her expertise in first responder mental health and wellbeing. She's also a widely published author and sits on numerous boards, and is an ambassador for the Victoria Police Mental Health and Wellbeing Committee and an expert consultant with the Emergency Services Foundation Victoria. Welcome, Erin. Your new role, what can you tell us about it?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, look, it's really been exciting for me to be able to join the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma, particularly in Asia Pacific. So that's where my role is focused. Look, we know that journalists play a really important role in keeping us all informed when traumatic events unfold. And we only have to look around us at the moment and turn on the telly to see disasters and conflict and disease. And so, you know, we know that they've got a really important role in keeping us up to date with that, but they also have an equally important responsibility to interact with the people in their stories in a sensitive and trauma-informed way, and to tell their stories in a way that actually respects the trauma experience of those involved, and also then to be really aware of the audience that are going to be watching those stories. And so the Dart Centre here in Asia Pacific and the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma more broadly do a really amazing job in both educating journalists in what it means to be trauma informed and how to apply this in their work, but also in supporting journalists themselves who might be traumatised by actually doing their job.
It's one thing to send the journalists out there to witness and report these horrific things. How do we know that they're actually emotionally equipped to do that before we send them?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And one thing I've been learning, I've only been in this role for 3 months now, and previous to that I was working within the emergency service organisations for almost 2 decades. And it's interesting, I've been seeing quite a few similarities coming across. There's obviously a lot of differences between the two cultures, but in the organisations, but also a lot of similarities. And what I've been noticing and what I've been hearing is that, you know, a lot of the time we don't even know we've been traumatised until almost, you know, we're in the thick of it and we are traumatised. And so what's really important in the journalism, media and media organisations is to really start looking at strategies that help prevent and mitigate this trauma before our journalists and our media workers have been traumatised. And that's the trick, and that's where the Dart Centre plays a really important role, is helping organisations prevent the trauma occurring in their staff before it already happens.
How do organisations, and first responders especially, stop that culture of, if I speak up, I'm going to be seen as weak, as a group of people who are used to rushing in where people are rushing from? How do we get them to change that aspect of, if I speak up, it may not only impact my career, but may let down my comrades or my co-workers?
Yeah, Michael, that's a really important question, and it's relevant to both the first responders who I used to work with and the new group that I'm working with now, the journalists. And this stigma is still a really big issue, and it's something that's unfortunately not going away anytime soon. And it's something that I'm certainly witnessing across the board in terms of, you know, it's still really a male-dominated industry in terms of that real macho culture, and it's still unfortunately that, you know, it's weak to speak kind of feeling out there, and that's something we definitely want to change. And we're making big strides forward in a lot of aspects, but we do need to change that culture out there and that feeling out there that we don't want to speak up, because particularly within this journalism and media organisation and culture, it's like, well, if I say that I can't hack it, or I don't want to talk out or speak out because someone else might jump in and take my spot, if I can't do the job, someone else will. So it's almost, you know, we used to see that, or I used to see that in the emergency service organisations, in that if you can't hack it, then walk away, we'll get someone else who'll put that uniform on and take your spot. It's similar with the journalists that I've been speaking to. You know, there's, you know, 10 more people ready to take your spot, so they just keep putting up with it and sucking it up. And we need to get past that. And one of my mentors, Tony Walker, who's the CEO for Ambulance Victoria, speaks so openly about his need to get his regular checkup from the neck up. And that's something that I like to talk about and say, we need to tackle this from a preventative point of view and stop being so reactive in our approach to supporting mental health and wellbeing. And look, we know on the whole, journalists and media workers are incredibly resilient, but we need to build in this really proactive and preventative approach because we know they are consistently going to be exposed to trauma. So what can we do to prevent any kind of stress reaction to that?
Resilience isn't something you either have or you haven't. There's a continuum, and there's only so much resilience before you're at breaking point. How do we stop that? Because in my experience, I've got a lot of friends in the first responders thing. It's more about managing overperformance than underperformance. It's more about holding these blokes back from putting their hand up for everything, and with journalists for every war-torn or every disaster, wanting to be the first ones on the ground. How do we manage that?
Yeah, and that's something that I've grappled with myself as well. And so the way I tend to look at it is, we have our resilience tank, or some people like to look at it as the bucket, and you can only fill it to some, certain points. And so, if you're looking at it from the bucket perspective, it can be one extra drop that you put in that can then cause the bucket to overfill. Or I look at it from my resilience tank, that I actually need to fill that tank. It's like a car. A car can't run on an empty tank. You need to fill it. And I do that with self-care. And so you need to figure out what works for you in terms of self-care to make sure that your resilience tank keeps getting filled up. Because, there's only a certain amount that we can do when we're running on empty. And, with resilience, when I talk to people about that concept, sometimes people are, this whole idea of bending but not breaking, and there's an overly positive connotation on that, because sometimes people say, well, I am broken, and so therefore that means I'm not resilient. And what are the consequences of that kind of thinking? And so I think sometimes we put too much of a focus on being resilient and overly positive around that. And it's okay if we break, because sometimes we do feel broken, and we need to look at strategies of coming back from that as well.
How do we stop that trauma response where traumatised people have that self-reliance, where that they really shy away from any interdependence, where it becomes, I can do this, I'm the one I have to depend on? How do we stop that, Erin?
And I think that's where this whole supportive culture is so important. And again, I was talking before about not being so reactive in our responses, but organisations really need to be looking more at this proactive and preventative response and structure, so that before people are in crisis and in a dark place where they don't reach out for help, that we already have supportive structures and supportive infrastructure around people, and whether that is having people around them that are checking in and reaching in before a crisis occurs. So there are rapport and trust and people around them and systems around them that mean that they feel more comfortable to reach out when they are in crisis. So I think it's reaching in proactively before something happens, so that people do feel more comfortable to reach out when they are in crisis.
Now, Professor, I'm going to try and tap your brain here outside of the journalists, but given your vast experience, how do we as the general public, as Joe Normal or Janet Normal, deal with the onslaught of what we've been dealing with over the last 2 years, between COVID, now the war, now the floods, and how do we prepare for that? Because there's a lot of either comparative suffering, well, it's not as bad as this, and there's also a lot of what I call toxic positivity. You need to count your blessings. And where should we deal with it as average people and as parents with our children?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question. And I think one of the biggest things I've learnt personally is that whatever you're feeling is okay. And, I have a lot of friends who do that, and, they'll be having a really, really crap day, and they'll be feeling, terrible or struggling, and they'll say, oh, but I know, you know, such and such has it worse, or they have it worse, or they have to always feel like they need to compare themselves to somebody else. I'm like, no, you're allowed to feel the way you're feeling, and what you're going through in the moment is your struggle, and you don't need to compare it to somebody else, because if you're going through a tough time, you don't need to compare to the whole horrible, you know, stuff that's going on elsewhere in the world. It's okay to feel your struggle and your, you know, devastation that you're dealing with. And also if you're going through something good and joyful, you're allowed to celebrate the wins, even though the rest of the world is struggling. And, you know, whether you got the promotion or your career is thriving while other people are struggling, you're allowed to feel that joy and not feel guilt around that. And I think it's really important not to compare ourselves to the bigger picture. Yes, it's important to be mindful of what's happening around the rest of the world, and we can't not be aware of what's happening on a larger scale. But I think it's also important to feel how we feel in ourselves, in our family, in our individual, you know, little bubble, because we can't always compare ourselves to the bigger picture, because then we lose our own perspective. And so for me, if I've had a bad day, I'm allowed to feel that. If I've had a little win, I let myself celebrate that little win, because you need to do that. Otherwise, we are being so bombarded with this cumulative exposure of one thing after another. If we look back as far as the end of 2019, we had the bushfires, into COVID, into flooding, and then around the edges of that, you know, globally, we've had terrorist attacks, we've had the Ukraine crisis. We just have not had a chance to switch off, and our brains physiologically respond to that, and we're constantly in this state of stress. And so if people are feeling a bit stressed about that, it's normal to feel that way. But if you're having ongoing problems and in a heightened state around that, talk to someone. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your GP. You know, it's normal to feel a bit stressed out about this ongoing state of the world.
All right, on that fantastic piece of advice, Professor Erin Smith, thanks so much for your time.
You're very welcome.